Hey, what's up everybody? Welcome to the Jank Divers, where we dive into the janky side of Commander. I'm Isaac.
And I'm Brent, and today we're going to be looking at Green-Black Vampire Fight Club. And remember, the first rule about Fight Club is to cast Prey Upon onto Singular Vampire, obviously.
So I first got the idea for the deck when I was browsing Facebook. I saw this guy post a help thread about black-green vampires. And obviously I had to click on that. So when I was reading through the comments, every single comment was just roasting him about why did you pick black-green vampires? There's no green support for vampires. So I did the natural thing and started looking into how to make green-black vampires work and what you could do with it. My first instinct was to go to these Sanger vampire effects and have them fight other cards with these fight effects that green is famous for.
So the two commanders we chose for this deck are Sengir the Dark Baron and Rayhan Last of the Abzan. Sengir the Dark Baron is basically the ultimate Sengir vampire. He gets 2 creatures whenever another creature dies, whether it be our own creature or an opponent's, and it doesn't matter if he fought it or not. He also has the funny ability of whenever another player loses a game, you gain life equal to that player's life total as the turn began. There's some funny things you can do with that we'll show you later on. Rayhan, the Last of the Abzan, lets you move your counters off of creatures that died to other creatures. It makes your board very resilient, as typically decks that build one big creature, that creature dies, you're donezo. Not the case here. We just move those counters onto another vampire and keep the train rolling.
So first we want to talk about our Sengir vampire effects. Now all of these effects do something whenever they fight or get into combat or kill or whenever something dies. So making these vampires fight other creatures are usually triggering some sort of cool effect on them.
The first of which is going to be the big Baron Sengir himself. Of course we had to include the classic. He gets +2/+2 counters, which unfortunately don't work with Rayhan, but they still make him very big, very fast, which is nice. He also can tap to regenerate any vampire, which is going to come in handy every once in a while. We also have Mephidros Vampire, which turns every creature we have into Sengir Vampire. It also will double up the effect on ones that already have the same ability.
Also, not all of our Sengir vampire effects necessarily put +1/+1 counters on themselves. So Soul Collector, whenever a creature dealt damage by Soul Collector this turn is put into a graveyard, return that card into play under your control. So whenever it fights something, even if it dies, if that card dies, then you get to steal that creature. Also, it is the only card with Morph in our entire deck, so if somebody has seen your list, you are not going to surprise them with that. But who knows, maybe you'll get some people with it.
We also have Yeheni, Undying Partisan. He has that Sengir Vampire effect just passively, so he doesn't have to fight the creature to get the benefit of it. He also has a Sacrifice outload ability for free, very powerful in this deck, as we'll see later on, and the indestructibility makes him very resilient in games. Alright, so the next kind of cards we want to talk about are our fight cards. And we have some more notable ones here along the bottom that are repeatable. Ulvenwald Tracker, Vivian Arcbow Ranger, which can also put counters on our creatures, which is very relevant in this deck. And we have Arena, which is a land very hard to interact with.
Notable about Vivian is her ultimate lets you choose a creature you own from outside of the game and put it into your hand. So this is not allowed in Commander. The official rules of Commander is that you are not allowed a sideboard, but some play groups let you play cards like this just for the fun of it. This card is still worth it because it's so powerful. Its first 2 effects are so good in our deck. But if your play group allows, then absolutely put some powerful vampires into your sideboard, and sometimes you'll get them. So next up I want to talk about our Vampire Tribal cards. A lot of these cards have to do with +1/+1 counters anyway, and they all are very useful putting out a lot of vampires. So Metallic Mimic and Bloodlord of the Vasgoth, they just put out a ton of +1/+1 counters onto vampires that are coming into play. So you play these, and then a lot of our vampires have flying, so it's really easy to trigger that bloodthirst. And then your creatures are just entering with a ton of +1/+1 counters, which just stick around because of Rayhan.
Then we have Cordial Vampire, Patron of the Vein, and Blade of the Bloodchief. All put counters on vampires when other creatures dies. This is very useful because in just Commander, a lot of creatures just die in general, even without us using fight cards or getting into combat. Creatures just die a lot, so it's going to grow your board very fast. Patron of the Vein, notably, also has a removal spell attached to it, which is very nice. And Blade of the Bloodchief can get one vampire in particular big very quickly.
So Champion of the Dusk and Malakir Blood Witch, they both, when they enter the battlefield, they do something based off of how many vampires you control. So many of our creatures, pretty much all of our creatures, are vampires in addition to their other types. So basically for each creature that we have, we're drawing a card or we're draining life.
Next up, we have Sorin Imperious Bloodlord. One of the best cards in this deck because he just does everything we want. He drains life, which is going to be relevant later. He puts counters on vampires, which is nice. And he lets us get vampires from our hand out for free, which helps us get down some of those 5 or 6 mana vampires a lot faster than we normally would.
And these keywords that Sorin gives our creatures are not irrelevant at all. So if our creatures are too small to actually win a fight against one of our opponent's creatures, that Death Touch will come in handy. And that lifelink, especially with some of our life gain synergies that we'll show you on later on, will help tremendous amount.
Next cards we want to talk about is our +1/+1 counter support. So right off the bat, we have Hardened Scales and Winding Constrictor, which just give us extra counters for counters we're already going to be putting on our creatures anyway. Our deck gets out of hand very fast with effects like this. Indulgent Aristocrat gives us a +1/+1 counter on every vampire so long as we sacrifice a creature. You'll see later we do a fair amount of sacrificing creatures in this deck, so that's not even a downside sometimes.
Also, the Uzalith is the perfect card for this deck. It's something that we can get out early, and as we're building up our creatures, putting tons of counters on it, it's just going to collect so many +1/+1 counters. But +1/+1 counters aren't the only counters that we have. You'll remember our original Baron Sengir. He has +2/+2 counters, and those stay on the Uzalith as well.
The Great Hinge, also just an absolute house in this deck, gets us more mana, which is always nice, gains us life, which again you're going to see in a second, very relevant. Also puts a counter on every creature we play and draws us a card for every creature we play. These two effects are just extremely powerful, well worth the card. Scavenging Ooze, also very relevant in this deck, gives us the graveyard removal that this deck has been lacking so far. Also gives us +1/+1 counter on the Scavenging Ooze, very relevant. If we have to sacrifice it or it gets killed, we just move them on to Rayhan or the Ozolith. It also gains us life, which is relevant. A lot of creatures are going to die naturally because of our fight cards, so this makes Scavenging Ooze particularly good. Something else to note with Rayhan and the Uzalith at the same time, when a creature dies, you can move the counters with Rayhan, and the Uzalith will also keep the counters as well, so you can kind of double up, which is very powerful.
Also, Bow of Nyla just kind of does everything we want. So it gives our attacking creatures Death Touch, which when our creatures start off small, sometimes that's really nice to make them not want to block them. Also, it gives +1/+1 counters on creatures, which is one of the main themes of our deck. It deals 2 damage to target creature with flying, which a lot of our creatures, like I mentioned earlier, have flying. So if they just have 1 or 2 chumpers, it's really easy to just ping down those little chumpers and get through with our big flying creatures. It also gives us 3 life, which in our life gain package, that'll come in handy later on. And we can also put up to 4 target cards from your graveyard on the bottom of your library in any order. This is nice for getting back more fight cards if you need it, or if they're trying to remove your graveyard, you can bring back some of those creatures back into your library. And we can always just shuffle our deck later and draw them when you need them.
The next part we're going to talk about is our sacrificing package. So, in addition to any sacrifice cards you might have seen before, we also have the Viscera, another free sacrifice outlet. Lets us scry one to set up the top of our deck. Pretty useful. Silver Mode School, one of the better cards in this deck. You can pay 2 and sacrifice him to draw a card. Very good to draw cards in these kind of creature value decks. You can get out of cards pretty quickly. And then if we gain 3 life, we can actually bring him back to the battlefield and sacrifice him again every turn, just creating this loop of drawing cards over and over again, so long as we can gain the life. Similar thing with Oathsworn Vampire. Doesn't have the card draw, but it's just great to sack away to a Viscera or something, and lets you play him back every turn. Very nice.
Phyrexian Reclamation and Oversold Cemetery are pretty much necessary, because we are sacrificing a lot of non-token vampires, so it's really essential that we get those cards back.
Finally, we have Kerahu Bloodsucker. Again, like a lot of the cards in our deck, hits a lot of the points that we want. He drains life from our opponents, which gains us the life we need for Oathsworn Vampire and Silver Mode School. Also has a sacrifice built in onto himself that also gives him +1/+1 counter. So again, a very high synergy pick for this deck.
Any of the sacrifice outlets are really useful with Rayhan out, because if you attack with a bunch of creatures and they all have +1/+1 counters on them, if they don't block even one of them, you can sacrifice all the creatures that did get blocked, move all those counters onto the unblocked creature, and get in a ton of damage this way. It's one of the most powerful things that you can do with Rayhan.
Next up, we have our life gain payoffs that we've been mentioning so far. First off, we have Blood Bond Vampire and Bloodthirsty Aerialist. Both get a +1/+1 counter whenever we gain life. You've seen the counters are very relevant in this deck.
Also, we have just Retreat to Kazandu. It's just an all-around. It does a lot of what we want. It puts counters on creatures whenever a land enters the battlefield, or we can gain 2 life. So you're not always going to need the life gain, but if you have something like Silver Smoke Goal in your graveyard, you can choose to gain that life to try to get that 1 extra life you might need to bring him back. Or if you don't need the life right at the moment, just put a counter on a creature. Counters are always useful.
Veto is useful because he converts that life gain we have into just damage, which can be very powerful. It also can give all our creatures lifelink, which is going to double our creatures' damage output and give our creatures damage even if they're blocked. Very nice to have.
All of these other cards we've already mentioned before. We just wanted to show you again that a lot of our cards in our deck just have some incremental life gain just attached onto them. So we're really hitting those whenever you gain life triggers a lot.
Silver Mode School, we just talked about it, another payoff for that life gain. Sorin has 2 forms of life gain on the card in addition to everything else he does. So now we wanted to get to what we found to be a particularly funny interaction that'll catch a lot of people by surprise. So Singir's ability, his second part, whenever someone else loses the game, you gain life equal to that player's life total as the turn begins. If you have a veto out, if you killed the player with the most health, or even if somebody else killed the player with the most health, it just kills the entire table except for you. Instant win. And I imagine this can kind of sneak under the radar sometimes because people a lot of times are probably going to write off Singir's second ability as just kind of like a joke thing put in for fun. But you can actually really gotcha people with this in this deck. Should be a pretty funny way to win a game every once in a while.
We also wanted to mention some of our utility lands real quick. High Market, just a sack outlet that also gains us some life. Karn's Bastion is just a great way to proliferate. We have a lot of +1/+1 counters on creatures and a handful of planeswalkers. So getting counters on all of those, just super useful. Llanowar Reborn, also just another land that puts +1/+1 counters on our creatures.
Castle Lochthwain and Path of Ancestry both help us with setting up the top of our deck and drawing cards. Helps us with our card selection. And we already mentioned Arena, but again, having a fight effect on a land is just very powerful and hard to stop, so we thought we'd bring it up again.
And that is Black-Green Vampire Fight Club. I hope you all enjoyed, and if you did enjoy, please like, comment, and subscribe. That would be greatly appreciated.
Yeah. Got any suggestions for cards we should add to our deck? Things we want to remove? Drop it in the comments. We'll have the deck list in the description if you want to see the full deck list. We didn't go over every single card, and thanks for watching.